Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our hybrid event, Pushback Frontex, Politicizing European Border Security, a talk by our IDM visiting fellow, Schneckener. This event is also organized in the framework of the EU-funded project EU Act 2 towards democratic and inclusive Europe, EP elections, and active citizens' participation and contribution. I will start maybe by a brief introduction of our today lecturer. Ulrich is Professor of International Relations and Peace and Conflict Studies at Osnabrück University in Germany. He's also chairman of the board of the German Foundation for Peace Research. He specializes, among others, in European security policy, EU-Ukraine relations, international conflict management, state and peace building, political violence, and war studies. And last but not least, Ulrich Schneckener is also a member of the IDM International Council. So welcome, we're very happy to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And my name is Martina Talik. I'm a research associate here at the IDM, and I will moderate today's event. We'll proceed as follows. Ulrich will start with a presentation, which will last for about 30 plus minutes. And then we'll have a brief Q&A session. As the event is also live stream on YouTube, please feel free to write your comments and questions in the comment question. This is, of course, information for our online audience. And my colleague Sophia Beiter, who is handling technical support, will pass them to me. For the IDM, the topic of today's event is very relevant. After all, migration is a global phenomenon, and migration routes lead also through our target region, which you can see here in the map. For example, the eastern border land route, which I personally focus on, or the Western Balkan route, which is the focus of my colleague Melanie Jaindl. As the topic has become highly politicized and polarizing, it may often be very challenging to find the right words and language to discuss it. And the EU border security and Frontex, Ulrich, that you will be addressing in your talk is particularly controversial among many NGOs. But it will be very refreshing and interesting to see and hear your observations from the academic perspective. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Malvina, for this nice introduction, and also welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm very happy to present some of my thoughts and some of the ongoing research I'm doing in this area. So in a way, I have to start with a little disclaimer here. This is still work in progress. So this is an ongoing research project. It's a research project which is financed by the German Research Foundation. And it's a broader project, actually, looking into politicization processes in European security, broadly speaking. So the focus here on European border security is just one part of the project. It's not, the entire project. However, it's as I said, it's ongoing, so it's a work in progress. And it's for the first time that I can present some of my research and some of the quantitative as well as qualitative data in this research. So I'm happy to do so. The title, I think, speaks for itself. It will be basically about Frontex, but of course, Frontex needs to be seen in the wider context of European border security. But Frontex is basically maybe the most important cornerstone and the most visible symbol of European border security. Of course, there are other aspects when we talk about European border security. So when you think about the development of digital data systems, when you think about surveillance systems and so on, sometimes connected with Frontex, sometimes not. But still, Frontex being the major player And here you can see a bit of the Frontex development. So I just want to say that Frontex started in 2004, but then since then we have seen several reforms and updates of Frontex over the past years. Meantime, it has been renamed, actually. The official name now is European Border and Coast Guard Agency, but of course, it's still better known as Frontex. Over the years, we have seen not only increasing capacities, here you see a few numbers, how the agency has grown, and it will still grow. So there's a plan until 27 to have about 10,000 staff personnel as a standing reserve, in particular border guards. Also, the budget is increasing, and it will further increase until 27. With this increasing capacities, we also see increasing activities, of course. So Frontex has also expanded, in a way, its mandate from reform to reform. We see even more tasks and more programs for Frontex. So, of course, a big part of it, and I think this is also the part where most of the criticisms come from, the Frontex operations at sea and land borders. This is always done in cooperation with national authorities, of course, and also the member states, the EU member states, have to call upon Frontex to invite Frontex to have this kind of joint operations. However, Frontex is also more and more getting a role in the question of return and readmission programs. The fight of cross-border crime is part of the mandate. And of course, what they do is a lot of monitoring and risk analysis, risk assessment on irregular migration and on the development regarding migratory routes. There will be new issues coming up for Frontex shortly. Next year, we expect the start of the European Travel Information and Authorization system, which will be also with Frontex. So this will be a new big task for Frontex as well. We see also Frontex has expanded its cooperation with third countries beyond the EU. And of course, most of these working agreements Frontex has signed with other countries are in the European neighborhood. So the Western Balkan states or the Eastern Partnership state countries, they virtually, I think all of them have signed an agreement with Frontex. Frontex is also involved in a number of multilateral processes on integrated border management, and of course involved in many technical assistance programs with third countries. Here, this is a quote from the Frontex website, how they see themselves as a center of excellence for border control activities. And in a way, they also proudly claim that with their standing corps, they also have the EU's first unified law enforcement service. So this is, I think, a self-categorization they do, and even I think this categorization also may trigger already some criticisms. However, oops, back here. However, one has to say generally, okay, now I should go. Generally, we are here in the field when we talk about new border security, and I think you're all aware of that, that this has been a very controversial and contested issue from the start. So that we have controversies, that we have contestation here is not like a new thing. Already early on in this field, we had like a general, and of course here I simplify a bit, we had a debate where different political parties, different political forces had a very different view on whether or not the EU should involve in border security at all. So for some, the EU is providing too little border security, so that's why Frontex needs to be expanded all the time. For some others, it's already too much, so EU should not be involved in border security. Maybe for very different reasons, because we know that, for instance, at the beginning in particular, there were also a lot of criticisms from more right-wing parties, right-wing populist parties, also against Frontex, because they saw Frontex as an element undermining national sovereignty. So for very different reasons, this was seen as too much. The EU should not be involved. And others see that Frontex or the EU by using Frontex is doing like the wrong kind of border security. They have a different vision, a different idea of how to do border security, border control, and in a less restrictive way, maybe. So we have these debates there. They have been there at the very beginning. And in particular, of course, particularly from the more political left, also from the Greens, there is a lot talk about Frontex as being part of something what people call the fortress of Europe. So taking this picture and call for like more open border or whatever. And I will pick more on that part of the debate because my concern is mainly about the politicization of Frontex through NGOs and networks of activists, which come more from this spectrum of the debate. And we could observe, in particular, since 2008, and this is exactly when Frontex started to become operational after its foundation. So immediately we could observe a number of anti-Frontex campaigns and protests by a number of NGOs and networks. I put here some of the signs. Of course, there are much more, and there are a number of different, slogans, labels, campaigns, hashtags, which are used: the anti-Frontex days, freedom not Frontex, ferries not Frontex, pushback Frontex, defund Frontex, and now the more recent one is abolish Frontex. As a campaign started more recently. I may also, point to the no Frontex referendum, which was a debate we had in Switzerland about, whether there should be cooperation between Switzerland and Frontex here. So a number of activities we have seen since then, mainly driven by these NGOs and networks. So in order to analyze these processes, and here I have to bother you with a bit of, let's say, political science theory or concepts. In order to analyze this, one concept which can be useful for this is the politicization concept. Politicization as such is not a theory in a strict sense; it's more a concept which one can use to understand better what's going on. Very simply, politicization can be understood as the transfer of previously uncontroversial or not publicly debated issues into the public sphere, where they can be subjected to open negotiation, public debate, and societal conflict. Yeah, so that's not a very surprising definition, but obviously there is some change here to observe how issues are addressed in public and how the public debate actually goes. And obviously somehow there is a relation to conflict, polarization, contestation. The politicization can refer to all dimensions of the political, so be it policies, be it the politics, or be it the polity. It's sometimes not so easy to distinguish what is actually the target or the object of politicization. However, in the field here concerned, I think most of the politicization is around policies and politics. However, the longer we see politicization on certain matters and highly, let's say, moving highly into contested and polarized situations, it may also affect the polity, the entire polity. So you start questioning the legitimacy, for instance, of the entire European Union, for instance. We would also expect varying degrees of politicization. So there in the literature, you find different terms for that. Some people talk about temporary politicization, or there's a full-fledged process of politicization. Sometimes politicization is maybe not with the wider public, but more with experts and more within the political elite. In order to how to know when we talk about how do we know that we see politicization, and here I think three, and this is also the consensus in the literature, three dimensions are important. We have to somehow see a growing awareness, so the topic is recognized among wider audiences. There is a perceived salience of the topic. And we see, of course, greater media coverage. So somehow there needs to be an increase in awareness. Secondly, there needs to be a mobilization of actors inside and outside of political institutions. And of course, the NGOs and the networks here, which are here in the focus, are part of that mobilization. And indeed, we see a growing community here of actors. Actor expansion and also arena shifting, so moving issues from one arena of debate to other arenas of debate. So it's not moving it outside of like the more institutional arena, like the EU institutions, moving them also in other arenas. So this is also a sign of mobilization. And finally, contestation of policies and institutions. So we need to have a real debate, competing claims and arguments, which then may further polarize and may even lead to societal or cleavages, maybe the development of new parties, new political forces. Of course, politicization should not be understood as a linear process. So we will not, very often we do not see like it's always like this in one, it just moves in one direction. On the contrary, often we have processes where you have feedback loops, recurring stages, back and forth. So the issues basically, I think the picture should be that issues move along a certain spectrum from being non or depoliticized to highly politicized. So within this spectrum, we see a lot of movement, and I think politicization processes can best be characterized more by waves and boosts. So we see in these processes high peaks of politicization, up and downs, and therefore in the empirical research, I think it's important to look into these episodes of politicization, and I will talk about this later. When we want to structure these politicization processes, it's also important to understand that there are different roles in politicization processes. And here, of course, we have to start with the politicizers, those actors who have an interest in pushing issues for politicization, to bring them out into the public, making them more visible, and not leave it like to behind the scenes or behind closed doors negotiations. And of course, in this case here, the Frontex-critical NGOs, the activist networks, and also investigative media, and sometimes some political parties can perform as politicizers here. Well, the addressees of politicization here is also very clear. It's Frontex and its supporters, being the EU institutions, but also member states, governments, but also the parliaments, in particular the European Parliament, is also an addressee of this politicization by the politicizers. And of course, then you have audiences, and this is also not always clear what are actually the audience, but of course, we have national publics, but we also have a European transnational public, which is of course more smaller one, more like elites, experts involved. Also what is the audience may differ from case to case or from episode to episode. if we look at the NGOs, how do NGOs try to promote politicization? And of course, if we look in the NGO literature, we find different strategies here for politicization. We know these also from other fields, not just related to this area here. So there are, roughly speaking, this three main strategies. The first is the voice strategies and strategy, and this is of course the most visible one. So when we talk about protest campaigns, I have already mentioned them, or like what often has been also the case here, the writing of open letters to institutions to do something about issues. So this is sometimes, which is sometimes also discussed under the term outside lobbying, and is addressing basically the public arena. The second strategy is it's called access strategy. Here we have more the involvement of NGOs in a term of giving policy advice, being prepared to do consulting or dialogue with institutions. So it's more an inside role NGOs can play within certain fora and consultative bodies maybe. So here it's more within the political or institutional arena where this strategy plays a great role. And finally, we have litigation, which means using legal actions, taking cases to court, and hereby using the judicial arena for politicization. So think about cases in front of the European Court of Justice or in front of the European Court for Human Rights, for instance, where NGOs try to bring spectacular cases there, which also raises some media attention and so on. So one can say that all the three strategies may have an impact on these three dimensions of politicization. How the impact is not so clear. All the three strategies have somehow can lead to increasing awareness, increasing mobilization, and increasing public contestation. So they all play a role here. If we now look at this field of politicization of Frontex or EU border security, one can maybe cluster the NGOs and networks into four different profiles. Of course, we have NGOs who are doing work in more than one of these profiles. Yeah, so it's not so easy to say that each NGO fits with one profile. Very often we have NGOs who are working here a bit and here a bit. But I think there are four key fields in which these NGOs are active. So we have, first of all, human and refugee rights NGOs, which do their classical work in promotion and advocacy, public naming and shaming. They also give legal support for organizations, but also on individual basis for refugees, for instance, or as I said, for refugees organizations. And here, of course, we have the well-known NGOs which are present here, who also have involved, like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, who also have involved a lot in the work on EU border security more over the past years. Secondly, we have like the more specific NGOs who have specialized in what one may call border watch. And these NGOs are of more recent development, actually, with the growing role of Frontex. Their role also grew. So here it's about the monitoring and the documentation of border violence, in particular pushbacks. Awareness raising plays a great role. They campaign for more transparency, in particular with regard to Frontex, but they also take up legal court cases, and fundamental rights also play a great role here. And here you have more NGOs who do this monitoring and have specialized in fundamental rights issues and transparency issues, like, for instance, like the German NGO Frag den Staat, which is a classical transparency organization, who also got involved with Frontex. Thirdly, we have this civilian search and rescue community. So these are civilian organizations who start these rescue operations, provide first support and aid for refugees, organize helplines, but also are followed and also promote, in a way, a lot of media coverage on what's going on, for instance, in the Mediterranean. And of course, also, I think that the NGOs here, I mentioned here, are well known so far. And finally, we have this wider field of humanitarian and solidarity work. Of course, you can also say the civilian search and rescue NGOs are also humanitarian NGOs, or they also would see themselves as humanitarian. But here it's more like the traditional humanitarian and solidarity work we see around refugees, incoming migrants, so support and assistance for them. Also empowerment plays a role, monitoring plays a role. So things like the Caritas, for instance, is doing, or other local, like, for instance, Solidarity Now are doing in Greece. And if one looks at these 4 profiles and the 3 strategies I pointed out, one can also see that there is a certain overlap in the way how they use the different strategies. However, there are also some significant differences, I would argue. So where the first 2 profiles are more closely connected to voice and litigation strategy, litigation plays less a role with the last 2 profiles. Access plays a greater role with human rights and refugee NGOs, and with humanitarian NGOs, which are more using these access strategies to change policy from within, whereas Border Watch and Sea Rescue NGOs not really using only partly using access strategies so far. Okay, if we want to know more about how the awareness has developed in terms of Frontex, and in particular the issue of pushback, which I think is like the most prominent issue discussed widely. One way of doing this is looking into how, for instance, the European Parliament dealt with the issue. And as I said, these are like data we collected to see in how far Frontex became a topic in the European Parliament, and in how far pushbacks are addressed in the European Parliament. And here we simply looked into the parliamentary documents, different type of documents, and the numbers here is simply like counting all these different documents where Frontex or pushbacks are addressed. This tells us a bit about, okay, there is some awareness, there is growing awareness, and awareness goes up and down, and obviously there are peaks of awareness here. And it is also interesting to see that the issue of pushback received great awareness over the past, in particular, since after 2019, 2020, we see a huge increase in pushback as a topic at the European Parliament. So it tells us a lot about awareness in the first place, but it also tells a bit also more implicitly about contestation, because the argument can be made that, of course, the more an issue becomes an issue in the European Parliament, the more I think the assumption is legitimate to say it is also a very contested issue. Because if an issue is very essential, not very controversial, it will probably not make up such a noise in the parliament. So I think there's also a hidden message here. And of course, also to find out what could be interesting episodes for of politicization to look at. These graphs are also quite telling, and I come to this later. To look into a national public, we did the same with the German Bundestag here, and we see similar graph, a little bit more, less up and down. It's more like going up in terms of Frontex. Obviously, the Frontex issue became very much a concern of the German Bundestag over the past years, as well as the topic of pushback. So in a way, this really mirrors what we have seen with the European Parliament as well. Another way of trying to find something out about awareness, and not about political awareness, but about public awareness, is looking at media coverage. And of course, this can be done in different ways. Here, we simply were looking into German media. So there is this Genius database of German print and online media. And here, it's rather easy to figure out the media coverage. So how many articles addressing the issue of Frontex. This does not tell whether that is a controversial article or whether that's simply just a reporting, kind of neutral reporting on Frontex activities. However, one can make the same argument as we did with the parliaments. If we see greater media coverage, it is a sign also for greater contestation, one would say. And again, here we see, in particular since 2014-15, a growing media interest on the German side in Frontex, and also again the pushback issue, again very dominant over the past years, and not so relevant in the German media actually before, as one might probably think of. And it might look different in other national media. If you look in Spanish media, if you look in Italian media, it would probably show a bit different picture. From these data, from these, looking into the parliamentary documents, looking into media coverage, one could derive, and also if we look then into more qualitative data on the actually what the NGO and the network community did, I think one can argue that we, over the past years, we have seen 3 episodes of politicization. So the kind of the high peaks, or these episodes in which we have seen higher degrees of politicization than in other periods. And I would briefly address these 3 episodes. The first episode somehow between 2009 to 2011. I said earlier that in 2008, we had the first kind of anti-Frontex protests, but of course it needed some time until they became like a bigger wave. It was, at the beginning, was very few activists gathering protests and demonstrations, but it became a bit broader. So we saw a first wave here. We had also, at the same time, early reports on pushbacks by national agencies, not yet linked to Frontex activities, of course, because we had still these early days. But there was a general debate about the legal basis for Frontex operations. This was how should Frontex be operational, and what would be the safeguards when Frontex goes operational? What would be the safeguard for fundamental and human rights at Frontex? This was a very much a key topic for the NGOs, in particular for the human rights and refugee NGOs in this period, because in the initial foundation of Frontex, and also in the first reform, there was not a lot said about how Frontex would actually deal with this issue. And this only changed, and this would be then the policy response to this first period of politicization. This changed only with the Frontex reform of 2011, when Frontex had to give itself its own fundamental rights strategy. They published it in 2011. They installed the fundamental rights officer within their machinery as a standard operating procedure. We can then discuss how it worked in practice, and this is something which in the third episode was also very much contested. And they set up this consultative forum. And the consultative forum was a way of trying to co-opt the NGO scene, or at least part of the NGO scene. So the consultative forum is a forum which was established in 2012, 15 members initially, and 9 of these 15 members were representatives from NGOs. So like also Amnesty International was present there, and also the Caritas and other NGOs were present there. And that was meant to be a consultative body to further advise, have a dialogue with the Frontex bureaucracy on the issue of fundamental rights in particular. This consultative forum, in a way, is also a form of access. So for the NGOs here, you could see this is where they could use the access strategy within this consultative forum. However, over the years, one has to say that this consultative forum, the role of it, has largely more or less marginalized. There are a lot of complaints from the NGO side that this is not really working, that we're not listening, we're not taking into account. And this is maybe already getting a little bit into the future. If one looks over the development of this consultative forum, more and more NGOs left the consultative forum over the past years. So now in 23, we have only 5 NGOs left in the consultative forum. So you see a decline here. NGOs no longer interested in being involved here. The second episode is the episode which, to some extent, of course, corresponds with the more general, what has been called the migration crisis or the refugee crisis, whatever. I think all these terms are not very helpful anyhow. But in this period, I think there was a major development also within the NGO scene, as well as regarding how Frontex developed and also how policy responses, what kind of policy responses we saw here. And this episode basically starts with the end of the Italian Mare Nostrum operation. I think many of you are still aware of that. Was an important operation by the Italian state, which was deliberately set up as a rescue operation. Not only border protection, but also as a sea rescue operation. It was criticized by the NGOs as being not sufficient, but the shock was even greater when Italy said, okay, we are now going to stop it because we don't get help from the European partners to prolong that operation. And then Frontex started its Operation Triton, which was deliberately set up as a border protection operation instead of a sea rescue operation, which then triggered, of course, enormous protest by the NGO scene, because obviously then in comparison, Mare Nostrum was seen as much better than what was followed up by Frontex. Of course, the design of Triton also changed over the years. It was not, it started smaller in the beginning, and then they expanded a little bit their mandate. However, they made very clear at the beginning, we are not here for rescue. We are here for border protection. The reaction in the NGO scene was not only these protests and new campaigns against Frontex, also within the European Parliament, you could see political voices who were protesting against this. But you see also the mobilization of a complete new scene of NGOs, and these are these sea and rescue NGOs, which I have alerted to earlier, which were set up at this period. And in this period from 2014 to 2020, for instance, in the Central Mediterranean area, there were at least 13 search and rescue NGOs active with 25 rescue boats of different size and with different capacities. There are figures that they rescued more than 100,000 refugees over the period of 3 years. So in a way, it was a significant contribution in this way. Often in this initial period, in cooperation with Italian authorities, and particularly with the border authorities, or Maltese authorities for that matter. So in the first way, it was a kind of cooperative setting, or let's say more cooperative setting at the beginning. However, that changed with the end of 2016, early 2017, when the policy responses were much more harsh here, and there was starting a kind of a counter campaign against these NGOs, in particular against the sea and rescue NGOs, in order to delegitimize or criminalize these NGO activities. And we have here statements from the Frontex director as well as from national governments. Of course, also the tone of the Italian government became much tougher, but also we had also comments from other governments also in Eastern Europe, where they claim that these NGOs are basically pull factors for irregular migration. They are simply helping the smugglers. They are, because of these NGOs, we have more irregular migration than we would have without them. Actually, there's no empirical proof for that. Actually, there are many studies who prove that this link is not true. But of course, this argument was done over and over again in the political area. There were some kind of these more polemic words like calling these NGOs a sea taxi or calling them vice smugglers. So there was a lot of polemic wording here in this period. But this was not just only discourse, but also it translated into legal investigations and restrictions for these sea and rescue NGOs. So we have seen the blockade and the confiscation of NGO ships. We have seen the closing of ports, in particular after 2018, Italian ports, delays that ships could not get into the ports. So all the things we have also seen in media. The Italian government in 2017 also started to hand out this code of conduct where they tried to regulate the work of the sea and rescue NGOs. And here it was an interesting development to see that it led basically to a certain split in this NGO community, because some of the rescue NGOs signed this code of conduct, mostly those who saw themselves as more traditional humanitarian actors who wanted to continue to cooperate with state authorities and didn't want to politicize too much the issue. They said, well, we are here just to save lives. It's not political. We just want to save lives. It's not about politics. And therefore, we could sign this code of conduct, which also actually made their work more difficult because they got more restrictions. Whereas others who have more this kind of advocacy agenda and play more the voice card, they rejected to sign this code of conduct. And they tried to continue their work, but they faced much more police action. And of course, after 2018, when we had a new government in Italy with Cinque Stelle and Lega Nord, the situation became even more difficult for these NGOs. And therefore, we have seen a decline of these NGOs' activities after 2017. So the high peak of civilian sea and rescue was between 2014 and 16, 17, and then since then, we have a decline. And finally, the third episode is probably the one which is, maybe also something most of us have followed over the past years, and it's maybe the most who gets the most attention, the most awareness, the most public awareness, maybe also in wider publics. And also outside of like institutional arenas. However, a lot of institutional arenas were involved here, and this is the episode which one can call the pushback scandal of 2020 to 22, and maybe one can also argue maybe the episode is still ongoing. And here this is basically related to a lot of NGO protests and campaigns increasingly again when we had more and more reports about direct or indirect involvement of Frontex with regard to push and pullbacks by the border guards of member states, in particular in the Aegean Sea, but also in the Central Mediterranean and on the Balkan routes as well. So think about Croatia, Bosnia, Hungary, Serbia, and so on, where you also had Frontex personnel on the ground. And so Frontex became more and more associated with these pushback activities, or with these, let's say, illegal practices of some member states. And this NGO starting, or they started before, but now it got more attention also by some of the media, because much more documentation came up, much more proofs in terms of media reports, videotapes, and also the leaking of Frontex documents. So we have seen a wave of leaking of documents by NGOs. So however they got these documents, but they were leaked then, which shows also the role of Frontex in this, which is to some extent unclear, intransparent. It's not that Frontex is doing these pushbacks. This was not the kind of main criticism, but it's not doing anything to prevent to doing something against these practices, or do a proper reporting about these practices, or change its operations, because it's in the rule of Frontex, and I think most of you know that if there are serious incidents, then Frontex personnel has to withdraw from these operations. And of course, this is a tricky thing for Frontex to make this decision to withdraw, and thereby also blaming, of course, this would be also a blaming of member state activities. But this were, I like all the accusation against Frontex, so there was a lot of voice here in this period, but we saw also a lot of litigation here. And I just want to feature two issues which are probably not less known. There was an ongoing conflict between Frontex and the German NGO Frag den Staat on transparency matters. Frag den Staat was asking for the disclosure of information already back in 2018 on pushback aspects. The Frontex denied to disclose these documents and was backed also by the European Court of Justice in not doing this. However, then there was a follow-up conflict about who is now responsible for the cost of this legal process. And then Frontex sent a huge bill to Frag den Staat to pay the cost of that. But then Frag den Staat started a campaign about this. So they turned it around. They used it again for campaigning. And they were actually supported by a majority in the European Parliament with this. And there was a resolution in the European Parliament asking Frontex to remove this bill from Frag den Staat. And this was also an issue which triggered some media attention, of course, also because of the involvement of some MEPs here. And another development, which is also something which is probably more recent, we saw now the first lawsuits at the European Court of Justice against Frontex by NGOs based on individual cases of asylum seekers. So people who now say, we have been pushed back, we have been pulled back. So NGOs have now started to investigate these individual cases and try to bring them to some of the European courts. And the claim is also here that Frontex didn't do anything to stop this practice or prevent this practice. Well, the policy responses here now have been very different from the period before, because we saw a huge engagement of different institutions and agencies here in investigating Frontex. So it was a really difficult time for Frontex, one has to say. And I think everybody who works with Frontex knows about that. Frontex itself started an internal inquiry, its own working group, to investigate whether they had done something wrong with their internal procedures, also their reporting system. However, that was not seen as sufficient. And then the European Ombudsman, who's actually a woman, kicked in with her own report. You have the Olaf report, started investigation on Frontex, not only on the pushback question, but also on budgetary and other issues like the professional misbehavior, for instance. Not living up to professional standards. So there were a number of issues in the Olaf report, which was later also leaked by a media and NGO, and it's online. You can read it. And also there was a special report of the European Court of Auditors on whether or not Frontex is effective in terms of EU border security. It was also turned out to be very critical report actually on Frontex. In the European Parliament, we have seen this issue has been taken up by the Frontex scrutiny working group, which became very important, set up by the Libe Committee in the European Parliament for doing some fact-finding. They had public hearings, all recorded. They had a number of sessions with experts, also involving NGOs. And they came out also with a fairly critical report, which also with a number of recommendations, like, for instance, strengthening the role of the fundamental rights monitors at Frontex operations, what also the new director has said that he would take these recommendations into account. And the final report of the working group summarizes and said that they said, okay, there's no direct performance of pushbacks by Frontex, but Frontex did not prevent these violations nor reduce the risk of future fundamental rights violations. So this was the result of the report here. And all that finally led to the resignation, as we all know, of the Frontex executive director Leggeri in April 22. So because the public pressure and the pressure from the political institution became too high. Yeah, to conclude in a way, first, here you see, and I'm not going into detail here, also not being too long here. Of course, the issue of pushbacks and pullbacks is only one of the issues on this list. If we talk about what are the issues for public contestation with Frontex, you see a number of issues here. All have been raised by the NGOs, communities, and by these networks of activists, and partly also by political parties, members of parliament, so a lot of different aspects on starting with the normative legitimation of EU border security in general. Of course, this more like meta debate on how to organize European border security in the first place. The mandate of Frontex is very much put into question. What Frontex actually should do. Of course, a lot of NGOs now campaigning very much, turning Frontex into a European search and rescue program, as one campaign has it. Yeah. So defund Frontex, for instance, is this campaign. They call, don't spend the money on Frontex, but use it for something else. Of course, the question of who controls Frontex is very much an issue. The question of transparency, responsibility, and accountability has come up all the time, in particular also in this last episode of politicization, pushbacks I have mentioned, but there are also other issues which are mentioned by NGOs, which are also part in these episodes of politicization. To conclude, so what can we make out of that? And this is just some preliminary conclusions. I think what we have seen over this time period is an intensifying politicization. So I think even if we look at these 3 episodes, we see in each episode was more intensified than the episode before when it comes to politicization. And I think all the data we have looked at would confirm that. So we can see over time there is an increasing awareness politically as well as publicly. There is an increasing mobilization, in particular with regard to the NGO community. And we see also an increasing public contestations across a number of issues, as I have said. However, that politicization, I would say, is still can be still more characterized as a temporary one. It's mainly event-driven. So in particular, these pushback events are always like triggers for politicization. Not the only triggers, but also, of course, catastrophes on sea have been very much points where we have seen new waves of politicization, like the Lampedusa incidents and others. Frontex-critical NGOs are using mainly voice strategies. This is not surprising. But of course, what we can see and observe is that they increasingly also use litigation strategies. So litigation became much more an issue for NGOs, whereas access strategies have been tried out once in a while, but have been less successful, I think, from the viewpoint of the NGOs. And I've pointed, for instance, to the story of the consultative forum at Frontex. In countering these politicization, we have seen interesting, and I have not really did a lot of research on this so far, attempts of depoliticization. Yeah, so of course, one way of dealing with politicization is to attack or accuse as a target became an object of politicization is try to depoliticize the matter. And then, of course, you can do this by different means. And here, I think when we look at policy responses, we can see that Frontex and also member state authorities have used different ways. Of course, the securitization of migration in general is a classical depoliticizing strategy. And you say, okay, this is a security issue. It's an emergency issue. We have to do something. We have no time to discuss, no time to think about alternatives. This is what we have to do. Yeah, this is it's a very depoliticizing, forceful depoliticizing instrument if you get it through. Of course, also a way is to technocraticize things. It's more like, you know, it's a technical matter for the security. It's not a political matter. It's basically a technical matter where you have some you know, devices in place, and you do like, it's a more, also the term integrated border management is already a very technocratic term, which try to depoliticize the issue actually. Also, one can say on a more, let's say, also kind of critical note, you find also this among discussing among NGOs here, is that there is also to humanitarianize the discourse of search and rescue could also depoliticize it. This was the example of these more traditional NGOs who say, well, it's about saving lives, but not about politics. They try to depoliticize themselves in order to, you know, to do their work. And of course, what we have seen with the last episode, with the second episode in particular, is the criminalization of NGOs. So you move it out of the political discourse into a more legal matter, a police enforcement matter. Final word. I think we will still see a further politicization of EU border security. I think we will see more episodes and also in future, because we have not seen a broader like solution or addressing the broader field of EU migration policy in which this is part of. And I would assume that we will see a further societal politicization on this matter as well. I mean, some of you may have seen these debates. We have also here in Austria, but also in other EU member states where right-wing populists try to hijack this debate as well very much. So you have this polarization between pro-migrant groups on the one hand and right-wing populist groups on the other hand, who actually campaign for legalizing pushbacks, for instance. Yeah. And I think we will further have this debate in national as well as on a EU level. What all that means for Frontex, I think, is very unclear to me at the moment, because the role of Frontex is very much put into question. On the one hand, we see that Frontex gets more and more capacities over the next years. On the other hand, it may be less, in fact, operational, because for Frontex, it's now a dilemma in a way that if they play by their own rules, and even more, you know, as the new director also pointed out, that they will take this more into account, look more on fundamental rights issues, they will be more sensitive with this, they will involve the monitors more in any of their operations and so on. Will they still be welcomed by the member states? Because then you have Frontex is also a certain watchdog for the member states' action. So in a way, the more Frontex goes into the directions NGOs would like to see it, the less they may become part of the business. because member states may not necessarily invite Frontex, and as we have seen also already with the Polish government or with the Lithuanian government, who were not very keen to have Frontex at their borders, as an agency which also reports on fundamental rights issues. So in this way, I think this will be a very difficult period ahead for Frontex, and it's not clear what a role might be in future. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you very much, Ulrich, for this very informative academic talk. 2 times 30.
Oh, okay.
No problem. It's very interesting.
Sorry.
So I think you demonstrated, you showed this expansion and evolution of Frontex really well, and you showed all those phases of politicization of Frontex. What I find interesting is what you mentioned at the very end, that in some countries, like in Poland or Lithuania, Frontex was actually this agency that was not present. I mean, in Lithuania, it is present right now. In Poland, it's not present at the Poland-Belarus border at all. And it's something that was criticized, not necessarily by the NGOs, but by media. So there was actually this wish to have Frontex there, exactly because of the code of conduct and the hope that it would supervise or overlook if fundamental rights are met. So this is a very different, opposite situation. In the meantime, Frontex is present in Lithuania.
Okay.
But what is maybe ironic in both Poland and Lithuania, pushbacks are actually legalized, which in a way is in conflict with the European law, as far as I know. So, but yeah, this is a very different situation. And what I also gathered from your presentation is that there was actually no time when Frontex was probably not politicized, because from what you have shown in your presentation was already 2008 when this process started, right? And I just wonder, was the crisis PR of Frontex then? Are there any consultations, campaigns that it could maybe run to change this image? And Kinga Virginska, we're calling for the idea, asks also a similar question. How Frontex should do its work, but at the same time work with civil society in constructive mode, and recommendations on their side.
It's a very good question. I don't think that I have an answer to that. I just put it on the table and say, well, that's how the situation looks like at the moment, and how we can also, as you know, as political scientists, also we can try to analyze it. I think Frontex made this attempt when we look back into this first episode of politicization to co-opt, to start a dialogue with NGOs, those NGOs who are prepared to have a dialogue with Frontex. Not all NGOs are prepared to talk to Frontex anyhow. So already this has already been also very much polarized, and also if you. I think the period of Frontex Director Leggeri was particularly unfortunate in this regard, because he as person, but also in the way how he operated, or Frontex operated in this period. This was more about a very confrontational attitude towards the NGO community, which of course led to further anti-Frontex reactions in the NGO community, and also further more let's say more, I would say, radical groups who have been there as well, but they also got more mobilized in a way. So the result was basically the opposite from what he actually probably wanted, maybe. So I think in a way Frontex has to go back to this path they started with, but take it much more serious than they did over the past years, if they really want to have a better understanding within the NGO community, if they want to transport their messages within the community, if they want to have a much more fruitful dialogue, if they also want to develop some kind of mutual learning from each other. I think they have to have a completely different attitude. Otherwise, I think that will still be very confrontational, as we have seen that in the past. But maybe after this third episode, there might also be some changes within Frontex, so that there's maybe a new window of opportunity here.
I can take one question maybe from the audience here, if everyone has a question. or a comment?
Comment, yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned, I mean, pushbacks are obviously the most visible, and I think that lends itself to politicization. And you say that you think that in the future there might be more politicization of Frontex in that context. I wonder, because at the start you mentioned ATIAS, and also increasingly there's this digitalization of border control, including this upcoming entry-exit system as well, and other kind of less tangible elements that on the one hand perhaps it doesn't lend itself to politicization so well. But on the other hand, recently we've seen a lot of debates around the use of AI and things like that. So I just was wondering how you see that fitting into the future developments.
I mean, I was also looking into this issue a bit to see what could be the politicizing aspect here. And of course, as you said, it's much less than with the issue of pushbacks or sea rescue, which is much more visible and also got much more media coverage and so on. There are criticisms, and there is a critical NGO community partly overlapping with this. I mean, they are part of that. The scene I try to systemize here, that is also very critical on all these issues, of course, as you know, when it comes to data and surveillance systems across the board. But this, I think, will stay more within expert communities. I don't think that this will reach wider publics or a greater media coverage, because indeed these are very, in a way, then also very technical issues here. And also one has to say that I think the salience for EU citizens is maybe less here. It's also that one else also has to say that also with the pushback issue, which also, as I said, triggers some of the politicization, and we have seen this also in the data. So, but if one looks on wider publics, well, we have not seen great demonstrations against pushback among by the German public or by the European citizens in general. This is always a very small minority, very vocal, very visible. So even the pushback issue does not really translate into greater, wider public protests. And this has to do with, I think, that many people do not feel affected. They do not see that this is about them, basically. And I think the same goes with the systems you're mentioning, because ETIAS will be for non-EU citizens, basically. So I think this will not trigger great politicization within public arenas within the EU. Others, as I said, are more technical, difficult to understand, and also to transport. Pushback is very clear. You see a boat, you see people suffering. So the moral impact here is much higher, which can be much more used for politicization. But even this politicization is limited.
There's one more question. Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very interesting. Two more aspects of politicization as well. So, for you, what do you think made pushback that much of a politicization success in a way? Is it that it's illegal, or was it really this moral imperative that you mentioned, or that it was easy to explain, or what was it that really made it such a mobilizing kind of concept? And another aspect of the question on the NGOs, actually. I very much like how much you looked into the NGO scene there. And I wonder to what extent actually the success or lack of success also plays a role in politicizing or depoliticizing the issue, because what I'm hearing from our colleagues in Thessaloniki, for example, is that the NGO scene has a huge issue more increasingly, because nothing is the situation is catastrophic and it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Nothing is getting, so that the whole mobilization and the whole advocacy doesn't seem to yield any successes. So yeah, just wanted to ask you about that aspect of success in a way.
Yeah, I think regarding your first point, I would simply share what you said, that the issue of pushback, and of course, there are different arguments about the legality here, and also the question, what do you define as a pushback? And there are interesting arguments also made by Frontex, actually, what is pushback and what not, and so on. So, but then, of course, this becomes too complicated then anyhow for the wider public. So I guess the moral implications here are much more the driver, and that NGOs can point to that, and that this is a practice which we should, which against European values, and we should not, and it's also against international law at sea, and it's also against fundamental rights, and so on. And it's a moral dilemma. It's it's against our own, self-understanding, so to say. And thereby you have the link to, okay, it has something to do with us as European citizens. Yeah, because at least this community or this part of the European population who also believes in European values can be easier addressed by this way, and saying, well, what we are doing at our borders is totally against our values, so we should not do this. Yeah. And so where the legal question is something more for experts, I would say. But of course, if you have a moral and a legal problem, then of course this is something, and you cannot find have good answer to this. And Frontex had no good answer to this, actually. So then you face this kind of politicization, I would say. However, indeed, with regard to the second point, it depends also very much how the discourse in this whole subject, in this whole field will develop. And now, while we had a more welcoming, and of course, maybe that's too much the German perspective, but I would also think in Austria, the situation was quite similar. While we had a much more welcoming attitude generally, in the year 2014-15 on this issue. Also, a lot of one should also not neglect. We have not yet. We have just a few data about this, but the increase of funding for these NGOs is a good indicator whether people like getting mobilized. They are prepared to fund NGOs and so on. And they had a successful period in getting the funding, in particular when they set up the sea and rescue operations, because you wonder where they will come from suddenly. I mean, they didn't exist before, and so they were a private initiative. There were people put a lot of money, actually, and some very rich people actually also invested here. So this was a period, and they also got a very positive media coverage in the beginning when they went out with their votes and so on and so on. And I think that this whole discourse is changing has changed in many of the EU member states, and we saw this in the election results, and I guess in Greece, in Italy, the situation, I mean, you can see this every day in the media. The situation has changed. So this may just from a purely politicization point of view, this may be now less appealing to the wider public as it has been in 14, 15, when the NGOs were able to mobilize this to some extent, also mobilizing resources for this.
And that also looks that this topic becomes normalized. So you notice how much media gives attention to it now and how much attention gave 5-6 years ago. We have 2 more questions online.
Yes.
And after that, I will close the official discussion, but we can continue, of course. Those are 2 questions from Peter Techev, our colleague. The first one is, how would you define the candidacy of Carola Racketa for the leading firm, European Lab, instrumentalizing NGOs, self-politicization of NGOs? Should I ask the second one as well?
Yeah,
Okay. What kind of role are churches as NGOs playing? You mean the Italian case, for example, Coptic Church helping refugees and criticizing Salvini.
Yeah.
Are their actions covered into your research as well?
Yeah.
Which one you want to start?
Yes, I start with the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I guess all you know who we're talking about. She became very well known as one of the as the captain of one of the Sea-Watch boats, Sea-Watch 3, I think it was in 2019 when she had this huge clash with Salvini. It was a big media coverage as well, and so on, and led also to some politicization in a way. But I think it was already the very end of this whole period. Yeah, and she's an activist, very well known in this whole field of migration and border policy, and she will now stand for the European Parliament, or that's the plan, to stand for the European Parliament for the German left. Well, I think has happened before, that we see people from the NGO scene, from activist scene, you know, trying to enter the proper institutional political process. This has been the case before, also on other lists. The Greens have a tradition here, Social Democrats have a tradition here to some extent. So this is not per se something new. Interestingly enough, it triggered a number of debates within the German left, because they are part of the German left. So in particular the group around Sarah Wagenknecht, who really doesn't like this kind of candidature, because she has a much more a different view on migration policy. So it's more like a sign also of it would maybe also more lead to a dispute within the left. We have to see, and the nomination is not yet secured. It's still in the process. Yeah. But of course, she will be, if she enters the European Parliament, she will be another visible and vocal voice on this matter for sure. Yeah, the churches, I think the churches play a role, but they are maybe less vocal and less visible, and the churches are typically using access strategies. They are using, I mean, churches not so much involved in, sometimes also they sign an open letter, or, you know, a bit of noise and showing a bit of voice. However, usually churches, as more traditional actors, are trying to engage in dialogues, in, you know, cooperation, and try to, you know, influence politics from within. And I think here in this field we see similar signs or similar tendencies. And I think most of the church actors are, I think, classical humanitarian solidarity actors, which I would more put into these categories. And of course, there are plenty of them. I mean, also in the member states, of course.
Great, thank you. So, Ludwig, thank you once again very much.
Thank
for your
you.
presentation.
Thank you
All the best
for listening so long.
And I also want to extend this thanks to everyone who has attended this event, both here at the IDM and online. If you're interested in our events, please follow our social media channels. In the upcoming weeks, we'll have very many events, especially on elections in Poland and Slovakia, and migration and pushbacks are also topic there. And we'll have very many 70 years IDM events in October and November. So please stay tuned, and we'll inform you through our social media channels. Yeah, take care and thank you very much.